As we come on the air this morning, New Zealand is reeling from the worst massacre in its history. It was an unprecedented act of terror for that peaceful island nation, but just the latest evidence that the global terror threat is not contained by borders or restricted by ideology. Islamic terror now increasingly matched by its mirror image, an emboldened and angry movement of white nationalists and neo-Nazis. And that threat has hit home here in the U.S. 11 worshipers killed at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh last October. 9 gunned down at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston back in 2015. The 2017 Torchlight protests in Charlottesville that ended with the killing of 32-year-old Heather Heyer. On Friday, President Trump downplayed that threat.
Do you see today white nationalism as a rising threat around the world?
I don't really. I think it's a small group of people that have very, very serious problems. I guess if you look at what happened in New Zealand, perhaps that's a case. I don't know enough about it yet. They're just learning about the person and the people involved. But it's certainly a terrible thing, terrible thing.
Our Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas starts us off. And Pierre, the killer in New Zealand, so clearly a part of this white supremacist community that thrives on the internet. He fed off that world, sent his message right back into it.
Yes, George, the alleged New Zealand killer appears to be fueled by anti-immigration sentiment and a deep-rooted belief in white supremacy. In online writings, he spews hatred about non-white people invading Western countries, and there are chilling ties to the U.S. Obsessed with race, the New Zealand suspect writes of Dylan Roof, the white supremacist who murdered those 9 parishioners at a South Carolina church in 2015. He also predicts that a fight over gun rights here in the U.S. will help ignite a civil war along racial and religious lines. And it turns out that he was inspired by Anders Breivik, who murdered 77 people in Norway in 2011 because of racial hatred. George, just a few weeks ago, authorities stopped a lieutenant in the Coast Guard who was allegedly planning a massacre targeting top Democratic politicians. He, too, was researching Breivik. So the concern here is that white supremacists, just like their Islamic radicals, are using social media to spread their hate, develop recruits, and is leading to actual violence, George.
And it's generally been treated as domestic terrorism, but now going global.
George, unfortunately, hate is alive and well. According to the FBI, we've seen a dramatic spike in the number of hate crimes here in the U.S., an increase of about 17% when comparing 2016 to 2017. There were more than 8,000 victims and more than 6,000 suspects. 58% of the suspects were motivated by race, 22% motivated by religion. George, and there are some numbers that suggest that since 9/11, the attacks, far-right radicals have been extremely active. In fact, between 2002 and 2016, far-right radicals were involved in nearly 3/4 of the fatal attacks here at home, though they killed slightly fewer people than Islamic radicals, this according to the GAO.
And posing a tough challenge for law enforcement.
It's an extremely tough challenge. How do you deal with this, George? There are so many people using the internet. When does hate turn into actual violence? You don't know when that's actually going to happen. So police are here and around the world have to depend on the community to tell them when they feel like hate speech is evolving into something more sinister.
Okay, Pierre Thomas, thanks very much. Let's bring in now 2 officials who dealt with these threats in the White House. Jeh Johnson, the former Homeland Security Secretary for President Obama, Tom Bossert, who served as Homeland Security Advisor for President Trump. And Mr. Johnson, let me begin with you. You just heard some of the statistics that Pierre let out there. Are we equipped to deal with this threat?
George, first of all, thanks for having me. We are equipped as long as we stay focused, in my judgment. Efforts against this kind of violent extremism begin with good law enforcement, good investigative techniques, but we need to also rededicate ourselves to identifying violent extremism at local levels through community organizations and the like. But then, as you noted at the outset, this is an issue that also includes social media. Social media now, there are very, very few barriers to entry and, frankly, standards for exit. And so it's incumbent upon social media providers, internet service providers, to be vigilant when it comes to hate speech content that violates their very own terms of service. George, I also believe there's a role for our leaders to play in raising the level of civil dialogue in our country and lowering the levels of extremist speech. Americans do listen to their leaders, And so as we enter this election season, I believe that the voters should demand that a prerequisite for office, for political office, is that our leaders adopt a more civil tone in what they say. People do listen to their leaders and are influenced by them.
A lot to tease out there. Let's get to it one at a time. And Tom, let me start with you on the second point that Mr. Johnson brought up, this role of social media. You know, one of the most chilling things about this attack, it was up for 17 minutes on Facebook before it came down. We're really seeing here Facebook and YouTube becoming force multipliers for a terrorist act. What do we do about it?
Yeah, it's extremely difficult, and I think the difference between content, which is hard to monitor and police, and video traffic might need to be explored a little here. And I've thought about this quite a bit, George. I think it might be time to think about delaying or forcing those providers to delay live broadcasting or live streaming. There's a lot of benefits that can come from individuals broadcasting from their telephones. There's no negative or downside to forcing some delay into that broadcast. It'll require some time and money, but I think it's something that we should consider.
And is that something you think can be done, Mr. Johnson?
I believe it can be done. I think we need to be careful in not having government agencies, and I know Tom appreciates this, going down the road of regulating speech or regulating political debate. There is a line that has to be drawn there, and I think first and foremost it has to begin with self-regulation by those who provide access to the internet.
But Tom, one of the things that your predecessor in the Obama White House, Lisa Monaco, said is that this actually does need a whole-of-government approach to take this on. Generally, domestic terrorism has been limited to the FBI. Is that something you think that President Trump might be resistant to?
I don't think he's resistant. I think what we heard him voice was a common kind of difference between how Pierre reported this and how I looked at it as a policymaker and how Secretary Johnson had to face this. I don't think that there's a comparison between the size of the threat between ISIS, which was a much larger, more organized threat to which we dedicated trillions of dollars in a global effort to reduce the outcome of violence. But they're also both morally repugnant and difficult challenges, and so we don't want to downplay it. So I think what the president said is it's a smaller threat. I hope he doesn't maintain the position that it's not a threat at all. Some resources are needed. Clearly, this is a trend that needs to be addressed. The FBI is not alone in this. The United States is different with our decentralized law enforcement, but the Department of Homeland Security and other government officials all have a role. I think Lisa was right.
And Mr. Johnson, we're also seeing, you know, a breakdown, really, in the sharing of intelligence about these kinds of threats across national borders.
Well, sharing of intelligence is vital. I can testify from personal experience that intelligence sharing across governments does save lives, does interdict terrorist plots. But clearly, when it comes to domestic-based extremism, this is something where I think intelligence communities need to take a hard look about ways in which we can see common trends and common threat streams. And if I could go back to what Tom was saying, I do believe there's a role for the Department of Homeland Security when it comes to countering domestic-based violent extremism. And as Tom knows, it's something I spent a lot of time on when I was in office.
And was that picked up on, Tom, in your days in the Trump White House?
Yeah, there was a lot of reporting on that, George, and I think, as I said earlier, the reporting ended up missing the real debate we were having, and it was the amount of money and the amount of threat. So we were engaging in some kind of distribution question of how we allocate our resources, which are scarce to some degree, against all the different threats. We've got 70,000 people a year dying of drug overdoses. We've got people not dying at the highest rates that we saw in 2001 and before from terrorist attacks, but that's because we were applying resources. So I think that this administration stands ready to invest more money. The question is how to effectively do that while also, as Secretary Johnson pointed out, not trampling on people's constitutional rights. So we're ready to spend more money if it's effective.
The other point that Secretary Johnson, of course, brings up is political rhetoric. And, of course, no one is blaming the president for what happened here, but he was held up, in the shooter's words, as a symbol of renewed white identity and common purpose. To what extent does the president have to take this concern seriously and modify the way he talks about issues like this?
Well, while I don't think that the two threats are equal, ISIS and white supremacists, they're equally repugnant, but they're not equal in size. I think what we can do and what the president has to do is combat the ideology of both. And so if he doesn't renounce, and I think he's done that, I think he can do a better job moving forward or redouble his efforts to make sure he's heard when he does it. Often he condemns this violence in his rally speeches. It's hard to cover those for 2 hours at times for the media. But if we're fair and if we cover his words, and I think ABC has been, and if he redoubles his efforts to make that a point, he has a real responsibility to do it. He can denounce the ideology of both and do it pretty powerfully from his bully pulpit.
If you could wave a magic wand right now, Secretary Johnson, what would you have the president say?
I would have the president say to all Americans, political leaders, candidates for political positions, that part of our responsibility as leaders, those of us with the largest microphones, have a duty to the American public to raise the level of civility in our dialogue. And that's something that I think is fundamental to our civilian leadership in this country. We've really got to rededicate ourselves to that.
Secretary Johnson, Tom Bossert, thank you both very much.